She walked into the office and asked, "Where can I buy a dad?" The Millionaire CEO's world stopped. "Let me know if you'd like a formatted version for a storybook screenplay or promotional blurb." It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Christian Blake stepped into the glass doors of his corporate headquarters. He was dressed sharply as always in a pale blue suit that caught the soft morning light just enough to look powerful but not flashy. His brown hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and his blue eyes, normally focused, cold, unreadable, scanned the lobby like they always did. To most people, Christian was the kind of man who could walk into any room and immediately own it. He was known in business circles as precise, unemotional, and unreachable. People respected him, some feared him, but no one got close. He liked it that way. Control was everything. Predictability was survival. That morning, however, was the beginning of something that would change everything. He was halfway across the marble lobby, nodding to his assistant who stood ready with his daily briefing, when he saw something that didn't make sense. Just near the reception desk, sitting quietly on the floor, was a little girl. She was small, maybe 5 or 6, with long blonde hair that curled at the ends and a white dress that looked like it had once been perfect but was now a little wrinkled over it. She wore a denim jacket slightly too big, as if it had been handed down. She clutched a small backpack in her lap, the kind with cartoon stars and sparkles, and her sneakers were scuffed. But it wasn't her clothes that struck him, it was her face. Her eyes were wide and the same piercing shade of blue as his. She wasn't crying, she wasn't making a sound, she just sat there like she was waiting for something or someone. No one else in the building seemed to notice her. Executives walked past in a rush. The receptionist looked nervously at Christian as if unsure whether to call security or pretend everything was fine. Christian stopped walking. Something about this moment made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with logic. He approached the girl slowly, crouched down, and tried to smile, though it came out awkwardly. "Hey there, are you lost?" The girl looked up at him calmly and said with absolute seriousness, "Where can I buy a dad?" For a moment he didn't process the words. He blinked, stunned. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone expected to hear, let alone from a child. The few people who were within earshot turned their heads, some out of confusion, others out of pure discomfort. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he asked, a little softer this time. She didn't repeat herself exactly. She looked straight at him and said, "I want to buy a dad. I saved coins. I need one." Christian felt his throat close. He had handled multi-billion-dollar mergers. He had stood calmly during board takeovers, legal battles, and hostile press conferences. But right now, in front of a child asking to buy a father, he had no idea what to say. Then something inside him shifted. He looked at her again, not just at the words she said, but at the quiet resolve in her eyes. This wasn't a tantrum or a stunt. She wasn't lost. She had come here for a reason. People around the lobby stared, waiting to see what he would do. The silence stretched, and then he heard himself say something he never would have imagined. "I can be one for free." She didn't even smile. She simply reached out, wrapped her tiny fingers around his index finger, and said, "Okay, but if you're my dad, you have to help mommy. She's sick and we have no money." That was when his heart broke completely. The entire room fell silent as he stood up, still holding her hand. His assistant looked panicked. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. For the first time in years, Christian Blake walked away from the boardroom, the schedule, and the perfectly structured life he had built. He let a child lead him step by step out of his building, onto the sidewalk, and into the unknown, and he never once looked back. The drive across town was slow, not because of traffic, but because every second felt heavier than the last. Christian Blake sat in the back seat of the car, his driver glancing in the rearview mirror with quiet curiosity, but saying nothing. The little girl sat beside Christian, her small hand still wrapped around his finger, refusing to let go. She didn't speak much. Her eyes stayed on the window, watching the streets change from sleek glass towers to older brick buildings and faded storefronts. Her name, he had learned, was Lily. When he gently asked where they were going, she'd said home, and given an address that Christian didn't recognize, but his driver did. It was in one of the lowest income parts of the city, an area Christian hadn't set foot in since he was a teenager, when life had been much simpler and everything he now valued, status, distance, and vulnerability, hadn't mattered yet. As they turned onto a cracked side street, something about the neighborhood sparked an old memory: a schoolyard, a tiny grocery store, and then it hit him, not just the familiarity of the place, but the possibility of what he might find at the end of this road. He looked at Lily more carefully. Her hair, her eyes, her voice, all of it felt strangely close, like an echo from a life he'd locked away. They arrived at a 2-story building with peeling paint and a rusted staircase. Lily hopped out of the car and tugged his hand urgently. "This way," she said, already climbing the stairs. Christian followed her through a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of damp wood and old carpet. She stopped in front of a door on the second floor, opened it with a key from her small backpack and pushed it open. Inside, the apartment was dim and quiet. There were a few toys scattered on the floor and a folded blanket on the worn couch. The kitchen was clean but bare. The walls were lined with old photos and drawings, clearly done by a child's hand, and there, lying on a futon near the far window, was a woman. Christian's heart nearly stopped. She looked up as the door creaked, and for a moment she didn't speak. Her face had changed, thinner, paler, but her eyes were the same, hazel brown, wide with surprise and something deeper. She tried to sit up, but her body was clearly weak. Her voice was when she spoke. Christian. He couldn't answer for a long moment. He just stared at her, stunned and breathless. He walked closer cautiously, as if the truth might dissolve if he moved too quickly. "Sophia," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded slowly, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "You're really here?" He sank into the chair beside her bed, still trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The girl Lily stood nearby, watching them both, confused by the silence. Sophia reached out a trembling hand and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said quietly. "How is this possible?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," she said, her voice breaking. "You left for London, you changed numbers, you were gone. I never got a call, a letter, nothing. I was scared, and then it was too late, and when I realized I was pregnant." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't want to ruin your life." Christian looked at Lily again. She was sitting on the floor now, calmly pulling a toy from her bag. "She's mine, isn't she?" Sophia nodded. The words hit him like a tidal wave. He had a daughter who had walked into his office and asked to buy a father, a daughter who had been raised without him by a woman he had once loved and somehow lost. He stood up, overwhelmed, pacing the small room. "How long have you been sick?" "A little over a year," she said. "It started small, fatigue, dizziness, then they found the tumor, and you didn't ask for help. I didn't think you'd care." Christian stopped. Those words stabbed deeper than anything. "I never stopped caring," he said. "I never stopped thinking about you." Sophia closed her eyes, trying not to cry. "I couldn't find you, and even if I did, you were so far from this life. I didn't think you'd even remember me." Christian walked back to the chair and sat down heavily. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman in pain, but someone who had fought for years to survive, someone who had carried their child alone, someone who had been left behind by more than just him. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not leaving." Sophia looked away. "She doesn't know everything, just that her dad wasn't around." "She knows more than you think," he said. "She came looking for me." They sat in silence for a long time, broken only by Lily's soft humming in the corner. Christian reached over and gently took Sophia's hand. It was cold and fragile, but she didn't pull away. "You need care, real care, not this," he said, looking around the apartment. "You're coming with me, both of you. I can't just pick up and leave. I have bills, treatments, I'll take care of it, all of it." Sophia looked at him, eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I should have been there," he said, "and because I'm not going to let my daughter lose her mother, not after everything." She didn't answer, but this time when he stood and gently lifted her from the bed, she didn't resist, and as he carried her out of the apartment, Lily skipped behind them, not understanding the full weight of what had just begun, but knowing in her innocent way that something had changed. Something big, something good. Christian didn't take Sophia and Lily back to his glass and steel condo overlooking the skyline. He knew it wasn't right. That place, while impressive, was cold, curated, and far too sterile for a woman fighting illness and a child who still carried around a stuffed bunny missing one ear. Instead, he brought them to his private estate just outside the city, a quieter place surrounded by trees and soft hills with wide windows that let the sunlight in and a fireplace that had burned maybe twice in the last 10 years. It had been empty for a long time, meant for weekends that never came, but now it felt like the only home that made sense. As they entered through the side door, Christian watched Lily's eyes widen. She didn't run or shout like some kids might. She just took it all in: the big wooden staircase, the quiet humming of the air vents, the smell of lemon polish and cedar. She held her mother's hand until they reached the guest suite, where the bed had been made with soft sheets that Christian had asked his housekeeper to put out just that morning. Sophia, still weak and pale, sat slowly on the edge of the bed. Her face showed gratitude but also hesitation, as if she didn't know how to receive this kind of help anymore. Christian knelt in front of her, resting one hand lightly on her knee. "You'll stay here as long as you need. Doctors will come. Everything's taken care of. You don't have to fight alone anymore." She looked at him, clearly exhausted, but there was a spark behind her eyes. "I'm not used to people doing things for me, I know," he said, "but let me do this." She nodded slowly and her shoulders relaxed just enough to show she believed him, at least for now. That evening Christian sat in his study watching the security monitor quietly as Lily curled up next to her mom on the guest bed. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day about what had happened. No meetings, no calls, not even emails. His assistant had texted over a dozen times, but he let the messages pile up. For the first time in years, work didn't matter. He kept thinking about Lily's voice asking, "Where can I buy a dad?" He'd built a world so far from children and emotions and unpredictability that now, faced with all three, he didn't recognize himself, but he liked who he was becoming. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Sophia sat with Christian by the fireplace. She wore a blanket over her shoulders and sipped warm tea. Her voice was soft, almost afraid of what might come next. "I didn't know if I should tell her who you were. I thought maybe I'd missed my chance." "You didn't," Christian said. "She found me before either of us even had a chance." Sophia smiled faintly. "She's like you in that way, quiet when she needs to be, bold when it matters." He glanced at her. "I missed so much." "We both did," she whispered, "but you're here now." They didn't talk about what had come between them, the timing, the missed messages, the mistakes. There would be time for that. For now they sat quietly, as if afraid that words might ruin the fragile peace forming between them. The following morning Christian made breakfast. He burned the eggs, spilled orange juice, and set off the smoke alarm. Once Lily thought it was hilarious. Sophia sat at the table and laughed until she coughed, and for a brief moment the room felt like a family had always lived there. Doctors came that afternoon. They examined Sophia gently, respectfully, and Christian made sure she never had to sign a single form. He wanted her to focus on getting better, not worrying about costs or coverage. The diagnosis hadn't changed. She still needed long-term care, but the treatment was now top level, and more importantly, she no longer had to face it alone. Christian found himself rearranging everything. His schedule shifted. He canceled travel. He delegated more grace. His longtime assistant called him and asked flatly, "Is the world ending?" "No," he replied, staring out at the backyard where Lily was making up a game with sticks and pine cones. "It's just starting." Grace paused, then said quietly, "You sound different." "I feel different," he admitted. In the evenings they all sat together. Christian read stories out loud, sometimes stumbling over silly voices that made Lily laugh until she couldn't breathe. Sophia began to regain strength. Slowly she walked short distances through the house, sat outside with a blanket, and started keeping a journal. Christian caught her once writing something, and she looked up and smiled. "I'm not just surviving anymore," she said. "I'm remembering who I am." Christian didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, quietly amazed. The woman he'd lost, the child he'd never known, and the home he never knew he needed, all under one roof. It felt fragile, yes, but also incredibly real, and for a man who had built his life on logic, control, and distance, that truth was the most grounding thing he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly began to feel like more than just a temporary haven. It became something warmer, something rooted, the kind of place where shoes were left by the door and laughter came from the kitchen. Not just the echo of wealth, but the sound of people settling into each other's lives. Christian had never lived like this before. His homes had always been spotless, quiet, curated down to the last imported vase or untouched bookshelf, but now there were art supplies on the dining room table, tiny socks in the laundry, and children's shows playing in the background. Lily was a force of nature in that way, gentle and soft-spoken, but always leaving her presence in the smallest, most unexpected corners. She didn't need permission to belong, she just did. Sophia, though still recovering, was improving faster than the doctors had anticipated. The treatments were working, and more importantly, her stress levels had decreased dramatically. Christian made sure she had everything she needed, from medications and private physical therapy to time for herself. He set up a quiet reading space in the sunroom just for her, with the same old poetry books she used to love in college, and even tracked down a rare first edition of her favorite author the day she found it on the armchair wrapped in linen with a ribbon. She cried not because of the gift itself, but because someone had remembered for Christian. Everything was new. He was used to results, to schedules and solutions, but now he was learning how to be present. He discovered that it took longer to teach Lily how to tie her shoelaces than it did to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. He learned that bedtime stories required patience and that it was okay to get silly, to mess up voices and laugh at himself. It humbled him in a way nothing else ever had, and yet it didn't weaken him. It gave him something stronger than control: purpose. Every now and then when Sophia was feeling well enough, they'd sit on the back porch together. After Lily went to bed, they would talk in low voices, not about business or obligations, but about the past, the missing years, the ways their lives had diverged, and by some twist of fate realigned. Christian had questions, of course. He wanted to know everything, what she had gone through, what she had felt, why she had never told him, and Sophia answered honestly, even when it hurt. She told him about nights spent working 2 jobs, about nearly collapsing on a bus after skipping meals so Lily could eat. She admitted there were moments she wanted to call him, to scream for help, but always talked herself out of it, convinced that he had moved on. "I watched interviews of you on TV," she said one night, voice low. "You looked like a stranger, sharp, powerful, untouchable. I didn't know how to fit into that world anymore." "You didn't have to," Christian replied, looking at her not with regret, but with something deeper. "That world was never real without you in it." She didn't respond right away, but she reached for his hand and held it tightly, not like a gesture of romance, but of understanding, of forgiveness. Meanwhile, Lily continued to grow more comfortable. She began calling Christian Dad without prompting. Just one day, while handing him a drawing she made, he nearly dropped his coffee when he heard it. He didn't correct her, he didn't question it, he simply folded the paper carefully and smiled so softly it surprised even him. It was a sketch of the 3 of them holding hands beneath the giant sun over their heads. In crooked blue letters she had written one word: family. That evening Christian tucked her in and sat at the edge of her bed longer than usual. She asked him if he was going to be there in the morning. He answered without hesitation, always, and he meant it not just as a promise, but as a choice. For the first time in his life, Christian Blake wasn't chasing the next goal, the next deal, or the next title. He was choosing something harder: being a father, a partner, and a man who showed up when it mattered. He had built empires, yes, but now he was building something more fragile and far more valuable. He was building a life. The first real test of this new life came not in the form of illness or legal complications, but in something surprisingly ordinary: a parent-teacher meeting at Lily's preschool. Christian had never been to anything like it before. The invitation had come home in Lily's backpack, a crumpled paper smudged with marker and crumbs. Sophia had been resting that day after a long treatment session, and Christian had offered to go in her place, thinking it would be a simple check-in. He wore a navy blue sweater instead of a suit, left his phone in the car for once, and arrived 10 minutes early, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He wasn't used to fluorescent lights and bulletin boards filled with construction paper handprints. He didn't know how to make small talk with other parents or sit on tiny chairs without looking completely out of place. When the teacher, Miss Howard, greeted him with a warm smile and gestured for him to sit, Christian awkwardly folded himself into a seat clearly not designed for someone over 6 foot tall. She opened a folder labeled Lily Blake and began walking him through her progress: how she was quiet but observant, how she always helped the other children clean up without being asked, how she once gave away her snack to a classmate who forgot theirs. Christian listened carefully, deeply focused, as if it were a business presentation, but as the teacher continued she hesitated, lowering her voice slightly. "She told me something last week," Miss Howard said, tapping her fingers gently on the edge of the folder. "She said her dad used to live in the clouds, but he came down when she asked for him." That's how she described it. Christian froze. He wasn't sure what to say. A lump formed in his throat before he could speak. "I just thought you should know," the teacher added gently. "Whatever you've done for her, it's working. She feels safe. That means more than test scores or behavior charts." When he got back home that afternoon, Christian sat in his car longer than usual, staring at the house he used to see as just a structure. Now it felt like something alive, something that carried the breath of the people inside it. Lily ran out the front door to greet him, a paint smear on her cheek and a ribbon half untied in her hair. She hugged his leg like she'd been waiting all day, and when he picked her up she rested her head on his shoulder without saying a word. He held her tightly, his hand gently cradling the back of her head, breathing in the scent of markers and apple juice. Inside, Sophia was feeling better. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a few papers spread out before her, forms for a part-time writing program she had been considering. She looked up as he entered and read his expression instantly. "What happened?" she asked softly. He placed Lily gently on the couch, letting her pull out her toys, then turned to Sophia with a voice filled with something close to wonder. She said, "I came down from the clouds." Sophia blinked. "She did?" He nodded, sitting down beside her. "I never thought I'd be someone's safe place." "You are," Sophia said, reaching for his hand. "Even when you weren't here, she felt you somehow." Christian looked down, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was becoming, not because he was unsure of it, but because it mattered so much, and because for the first time he was beginning to feel worthy of it. Later that week, Sophia had a checkup. This time Christian went with her, not just as support, but as a partner. They sat side by side in the waiting room, flipping through outdated magazines and sharing quiet jokes. When her name was called, he helped her stand and walked with her into the examination room. The doctor, kind but firm, gave them cautious optimism. The tumor had shrunk, her body was responding, and if things continued at this pace she might not need a second round of intensive therapy. Sophia let out a shaky breath and leaned back in the chair, her eyes glistening with exhaustion and relief. Christian exhaled, feeling as if the air had been knocked out of him. "You're going to get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. Outside the clinic, they stood in the parking lot under a wide gray sky. Sophia looked up at him and said, "I didn't think I'd ever have anything to hope for again." He looked at her and replied, "Now you have a future, and I want to be in it." That night they cooked dinner together. Well, Christian tried and Sophia supervised from a stool, laughing when he oversalted the pasta and spilled half the sauce. Lily sat at the table, drawing again another picture of the three of them with hearts floating above their heads. She handed it to him with a serious expression and said, "This one's for your office so you don't forget us when you work." He looked at the drawing, then at the child in front of him, then at the woman across the kitchen, and felt something he had never known before, the kind of peace that didn't come from achievement but from presence. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his briefcase, not because he would forget, but because he never wanted to forget what really mattered. Fall arrived, quietly brushing its fingers over the city in fading sunlight and cooler evenings. The trees surrounding Christian's home began to blush with orange and red, and Lily, ever curious, collected leaves on their walks and kept them pressed between the pages of her coloring books. Life inside the house had started to move with a rhythm of its own, no longer dictated by emergencies or adjustments, but by small, gentle routines. Mornings were filled with soft chatter, toast, and the occasional spilled juice. Afternoons carried laughter from the backyard, where Christian had finally agreed to build a small wooden playhouse, mostly because Lily had asked so sweetly he couldn't say no. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the three of them gathered for dinner, sometimes messy, always real. Sophia's health continued to improve. She had begun walking without assistance, climbing stairs slowly but with growing confidence. Her cheeks had more color now, and her voice, once quiet from fatigue, had begun to reclaim its natural strength. She spoke more openly, laughed more freely, and even started writing again. Christian had turned one of the guest rooms into a small study for her. He stocked it with journals, books, and a view of the garden that always seemed to calm her. It became her space, one where she could rediscover parts of herself that illness had tried to erase. She once told him that being in that room felt like remembering who she was before everything became survival. Christian, meanwhile, was changing in ways no one from his past world would have recognized. He still worked, of course, but less obsessively. He kept meetings concise, refused late-night calls, and took weekends entirely offline. His assistant Grace had stopped asking if he was feeling all right and instead started sending him parenting articles and notes like, "Lily's class has a field trip, don't miss it." He appreciated that more than he let on. One night after Lily had gone to sleep, Sophia found Christian in the kitchen sitting with a cup of tea he hadn't touched. He looked distracted, eyes fixed on something invisible. She sat beside him and waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and full of thought. I spent years thinking power meant being untouchable, that if I could control everything I'd be safe. But this, he gestured vaguely, this is the first time I feel like I'm living. Sophia smiled at him, not with pity but with understanding. Because you finally let yourself be part of something bigger than you, she said, and you didn't lose anything, you gained everything. Christian reached across the table, his fingers curling around hers. He hadn't planned to fall in love again. In fact, he'd thought that part of his life had closed long ago, locked behind doors of old memories and regret. But now, sitting across from the woman he had once lost and the child they had unknowingly created, he felt something solid take root in his chest. He was no longer running from silence or chasing success to outrun emptiness. He was still, and in that stillness he felt whole. That weekend they took a trip to a nearby lake. It wasn't extravagant or planned with precision. They packed snack sweaters and Lily's endless supply of questions. They rented a small boat and drifted for hours across the water. Lily lay across their laps at one point, eyes closed, completely at peace. Sophia leaned her head on Christian's shoulder and he kissed the top of her hair without even thinking. The moment required no words. It was one of those rare slices of time where nothing needed to be said because everything important was already felt. Later that night, while Lily slept in the back seat during the drive home, Sophia turned to him with a quiet smile and asked, "Did you ever imagine your life would look like this?" He laughed under his breath, "Not even close." "Do you miss the old version of it?" she asked. "No," he said, "I only miss that I didn't find this sooner." As the car rolled through the soft shadows of tree-lined streets, they drove forward into a life that neither of them had expected but both knew they were meant to build. And for Christian, who had spent his entire adulthood chasing a sense of arrival, he finally understood that this ordinary, imperfect, beautiful moment was it. He was already home. The first snow came earlier than expected, blanketing the city in white before Thanksgiving. It caught everyone by surprise except Lily, who greeted the morning frost with squeals of delight and her boots on the wrong feet. Christian helped her into her puffy jacket while Sophia watched from the doorway, wrapped in a wool scarf, a faint smile on her face. She still tired easily, but the color had returned to her cheeks and her laughter was more frequent now, lighter, as if something heavy had finally lifted. That morning they built a crooked snowman in the front yard, complete with a carrot nose and one of Christian's designer ties, which Lily thought was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. He didn't mind. In fact, he made a point to leave it on the snowman for the neighbors to admire. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. Sophia had taken to baking again, something she hadn't done in years. The act of mixing and kneading seemed to calm her, and the kitchen filled with quiet music and the rhythm of a home rediscovered. Christian, who once ordered dinner from five-star restaurants with a single phone call, now knew the names of baking tools he never knew existed. He didn't mind that either. Every day brought new rituals, ones he had never imagined himself part of, but now couldn't imagine his life without. But it wasn't all without challenges. One evening after Lily had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Christian walked into the study to find Sophia sitting in the armchair, her journal open on her lap, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. She tried to hide it, wiping her face quickly, but he knelt beside her and waited without saying a word. After a few moments she whispered that sometimes she still woke up afraid that all of this was temporary, that one bad scan could take it away, that Christian might one day realize this life was too small for him. He reached up and touched her face gently, looking into her eyes with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. He told her that nothing about this was small, that she and Lily had given his life meaning in a way no amount of success ever had. He said he wasn't leaving, not now, not ever, and if fear came again, they would face it together. She didn't respond right away, but the way she leaned into him said more than words ever could. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Christian received a call from a non-profit organization that provided housing and legal support for single mothers. They had heard of his recent anonymous donations and invited him to speak at their winter fundraiser. At first he declined. He wasn't ready to tell the world what had happened, what had changed, but Sophia encouraged him. She said that his story wasn't just his anymore, that if it could inspire even one person to step forward for someone in need, it was worth sharing. So he agreed. The night of the fundraiser, Christian stood on a modest stage in a small auditorium wearing a simple suit and no tie. He didn't have a speech prepared. He spoke from memory, from the heart. He told them about a little girl who walked into his office one morning and asked to buy a dad. He told them how that moment shattered everything he thought he knew about life, and how it led him to rediscover a love he thought he had lost forever. He spoke about the quiet strength of a woman who raised their daughter alone, and the way love had found its way back into his life through a second chance he never expected. The room was silent when he finished. No applause at first, just stillness, the kind that comes from people feeling something real. And then the clapping began, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't just for him, it was for what his story represented: hope, change, redemption. Afterward, when he returned home that night, Sophia met him at the door with a quiet look of pride. Lily was already asleep, but they stood together in the hallway for a long moment. Christian pulled her close, his voice low and steady, and said, "Thank you for believing I could be more than what I was." Sophia smiled, pressed her forehead to his, and replied, "Thank you for becoming exactly who we needed." That night, as snow fell gently outside and the world around them moved on unaware, their home remained full of warmth, of stories, of second chances, and in the silence between words something unspoken settled permanently into place. They were no longer rebuilding, they were already whole. Spring returned, slowly melting away the cold and quiet degrees, and with it came the feeling that life was no longer being rebuilt, it was simply being lived. The trees outside the Blake house bloomed pale pink. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and new beginnings, and laughter returned to the garden like it had been waiting all winter for permission. Lily had grown taller, her shoes no longer slipped off her heels, and her drawings had more detail, more color, and often showed four figures now: herself, her mom, Christian, and a small baby with a smile the size of the sun. She had begun asking with the boldness only a child could manage whether they could make her a little brother or sister. Christian nearly choked on his tea the first time she asked, but Sophia had just laughed, her eyes shining in a way that hadn't been there a year ago. The rhythms of their life felt settled but far from routine. There was warmth in their chaos, comfort in their imperfection. Christian continued to split his time between work and home, but everyone at his company had long since accepted that his priorities had changed. He had become the kind of leader who left early for school plays, who scheduled meetings around doctor appointments, and who once paused a shareholder call because Lily wanted to show him a butterfly she had caught in the garden. Strangely, the company had never run smoother. He no longer micromanaged because he no longer felt the need to prove himself every second. He had nothing to prove. His fulfillment didn't live in the numbers anymore. Sophia had returned to writing with fierce grace. Her essays about motherhood, resilience, and unexpected redemption began circulating online, gaining quiet attention for their honesty and raw beauty. A small publisher offered her a book deal, and when she showed Christian the contract, his hands trembled slightly, not out of concern, but from pride. He told her it was only the beginning, and she told him she already had everything she needed. The manuscript grew page by page, written between nap times, evening walks, and cups of coffee that went cold from distraction. Lily would sit on the floor beside her as she wrote, coloring or asking questions about the story. Sophia would smile and answer everyone, never brushing her daughter aside, even when her thoughts were deep in revision. One Sunday morning, under soft sun and scattered petals, Christian took them both to the park. It was the same park he'd passed 1,000 times without ever entering, too busy, too disconnected. But that day they brought a blanket, a basket of food, and no agenda. Sophia lay in the grass with her eyes closed, soaking in the sun, while Lily chased ducks near the pond. Christian sat back, watching them, the weight of his old life falling further and further behind him. He used to think peace was boring, but now he knew it was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever felt. Later that evening, when the sky turned orange and the air began to cool, they walked home slowly. Lily skipped between them, one hand in each of theirs. She began humming a song she'd made up, and Christian listened, catching pieces of the lyrics. She sang about finding things, about families you didn't know you had, and About daddies who come down from the clouds. He glanced at Sophia, who was already watching him. She mouthed the word miracle, and he didn't disagree. When they reached the house, Sophia paused at the front door. She looked at Christian and after a long breath asked him if he still wanted what they had spoken about months ago, something permanent, something legal, something that said in writing what had already become true in their hearts. Christian answered not with words but by pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. He hadn't been sure when the moment would come, but he had known it would. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, nothing flashy, just like her. Sophia didn't cry right away. She held his face in her hands and kissed him once softly, like sealing a promise. Lily clapped from the steps, not fully understanding but sensing it was something big and beautiful. That night they told stories over dinner, stories from the past and dreams of the future, and it felt like the walls of the house listened, holding those memories safe inside them. Months later the wedding was quiet, just close friends, a backyard strung with fairy lights, and Lily throwing flower petals with unmatched enthusiasm. Sophia wore a dress she'd chosen herself, nothing extravagant, just something that made her feel strong and beautiful. Christian, in a tailored gray suit, looked at her like the world had finally made sense. They exchanged vows not written by anyone else but spoken in their own imperfect, honest words, and when the ceremony ended and Christian lifted Lily in his arms to join their first dance, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. The life they built was not one born from perfection. It was shaped by missed chances, broken paths, and pain that still lingered in quiet corners, but it was also shaped by forgiveness, by showing up when it mattered, by love that chose to stay even when it had every excuse to leave. Christian had once believed that happy endings were for other people, but he knew now that real happiness wasn't the end of the story. It was the part you fought to build after all the chapters where everything could have fallen apart, and this messy, beautiful, everyday life was exactly the ending he never knew he deserved. This story's ending is powerful, not because everything turns out perfectly, but because it turns out authentically. It's about healing, not erasing the past. What makes the conclusion so meaningful is that it doesn't rely on dramatic twists or grand gestures. It leans into quiet, steady love and the slow rebuilding of trust and connection. The millionaire CEO doesn't just discover he has a daughter, he discovers the kind of man he wants to be, and that transformation feels earned. The beauty lies in how broken things were allowed to mend without pretending they were never broken. Sophia's forgiveness isn't instant and Christian's growth isn't effortless. That realism grounds the emotional weight of their reunion, and Lily, the innocent thread connecting them, reminds us that hope often comes from the most unexpected voices. In the end, this is a story about second chances, not the kind handed out easily, but the kind fought for, and in that fight a new kind of wealth is found, family, love, and a peace money can't buy. That's the kind of ending that stays with you.